At 13:47, the first radio burst came through the static. The operator froze, headset tilted, eyes wide as a weak voice cut across the storm noise. Mayday, Black Hawk 274 down. Coordinates unknown. 7 Marines on board, multiple wounded. Then silence. Outside the Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Talon, wind howled against reinforced steel siding. The rain was coming in sideways, thick as paint. Inside, every screen lit up at once, pulling topography, satellite feeds, and weather overlays. But the satellite feed was already blind. Storm systems had merged over the jungle basin, turning the sky into one massive static wall. The air in the room shifted fast. Coffee cups were abandoned mid-reach. A half-eaten protein bar hit the floor. Captain Rhodes was first to speak. His voice came low and tight, trained to stay calm when everyone else was unraveling. Get eyes on last known coordinates. Check fuel margins. I want 2 extraction teams prepped. Full medical loadout. But as more data poured in, the problem sharpened. Black Hawk 274 had gone down somewhere between grid sectors Foxtrot 7 and Golf 2. That stretch of jungle was known for cliffs, flash flooding, and tree canopies so dense even UAVs struggled to penetrate. GPS signals had collapsed within minutes. The onboard emergency beacon was cutting in and out, likely damaged on impact. Colonel Gerard walked in, reading from a tablet as he moved. His uniform was soaked from a sprint across the tarmac. Sit rep. Chief Warrant Officer Reeves stepped forward. Sir, we've lost full GPS lock. Terrain is uncharted. Weather cell closing from 3 vectors. No fallback site, no open LZ. Estimated fuel burn exceeds range by 40%. We can't get there and back without dipping into bingo fuel before recovery. The colonel stood still for a beat, then said what no one wanted to hear. That's a no-go profile. The room deflated, not because they disagreed, but because they knew he was right. Flying into that was a statistical suicide run. Risking another crew might double the casualties. Reeves added, visibility will be 0 in 15. If anyone's still alive down there, the clock's already bleeding out. A junior intel officer chimed in, her voice cracking slightly. Sir, the downed team includes 2 corpsmen and 5 riflemen. Their last radio indicated multiple gunshot wounds. They need extraction in the next 30 minutes or they won't make it. No one spoke. The air was thick with helplessness. Orders hadn't even been drafted yet. No one volunteered. No one even pretended they might. Through the wall of rain, an engine echoed off the distant canyon. It wasn't a rescue bird, just a routine supply run being grounded near the helipads. In that moment, with every map flashing red and every route closing down, the only question that mattered hovered silently over the entire base. Who would fly into that storm? Evelyn Moore had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Talon for 7 months, and most people still didn't know what she did. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet focus of someone older, someone used to being overlooked. She wore her regulation flight suit like armor, kept her tone even, and rarely spoke in meetings unless directly addressed. People assumed she was with logistics, sometimes medical. Once, a visiting contractor mistook her for a civilian admin and asked her to help fix a printer. She didn't correct him. There wasn't much point. When she introduced herself, no one heard former A-10 pilot. They heard transport crew, and that's where their attention stopped. The other pilots called her Moore without much thought. She wasn't one of the guys, but she wasn't openly pushing for anything either. So she faded into the middle ground where no one looked too closely. When flight rosters were drawn up, Evelyn's name was rarely placed anywhere that mattered. Her current assignment was routine logistics flights, cargo runs, personnel shifts, water resupply, the kind of flying that kept the base running, but never got anyone's name in a commendation memo. What no one saw was the logbook in her locker, meticulously updated with terrain notes, wind shear patterns, and acoustic anomalies from each flight, or the maps she carried, folded perfectly into the lining of her flight bag, hand annotated with elevations and suspected thermal pockets from old UAV surveys. She studied the land like it was alive, memorizing contours and echo patterns the same way she once studied insurgent routes outside Bagram. She had logged over 1 through 600 hours in the A-10 before stepping away from combat duty. It wasn't burnout. It was necessity. She'd lost 2 close friends in a mission that wasn't supposed to happen. When she came back to the service 3 years later, she chose a quieter role. Not because she couldn't keep up, but because she understood what mattered most was knowing when to be useful. Evelyn never brought up her prior missions. She didn't mention her time in Kandahar, or the night she landed blind after an ECM blackout and got the crew out without a scratch. Classified meant classified, and humility wasn't a tactic. It was just her way. Lieutenant Harris, fresh out of Fort Rucker, once laughed when he saw her cross-checking fuel flow rates during a pre-flight. "You flying today? More? Or just doing math homework?" She smiled, nodded, and walked back toward the hangar. That flight ended early when Harris burned through his margin and had to radio for mid-route redirection. Evelyn said nothing. There were dozens of little moments like that. A checklist double-checked, a flight plan corrected without credit, an overheard comment in the mess about how some folks just aren't built for zero visibility landings. They never said her name. They didn't have to. In the operations room, when pilot selections were made for extractions or quick reaction force support, Evelyn's name was always skipped, not because she wasn't qualified, but because she didn't fit the mental image. Quiet, calm, methodical. Those weren't words people reached for when danger called. But Evelyn didn't want their praise. She wanted readiness. That's why she reviewed emergency beacons for anomalies on her own time. Why she asked the radar techs about signal propagation in jungle airspace. Why she trained muscle memory responses in an empty simulator when others went for coffee. People saw her. They just didn't look. And Evelyn was fine with that. Because in the end, recognition wasn't the mission. Being ready was. She didn't need to be the first name called. She only needed to be the one still flying when others had already turned back. While other pilots finished their check rides and walked out into the sun, Evelyn stayed behind. She sat alone near the corner terminal in the operations bay, toggling between wind vector overlays and old thermal imaging files. Some of the data was outdated. Some came from declassified drone sweeps logged years before anyone on base had deployed here. She didn't mind. Patterns had long memories. In her flight bag was a spiral-bound notebook filled with sketches and notations. Hand-drawn routes traced elevation ridgelines and valley windbreaks. She had spent weeks analyzing canopy density and rotor wash tolerances. Most called that overkill. Evelyn called it Tuesday. She marked natural corridors where she could fly low and slow without pinging radar or choking the engine with wet leaf debris. No one asked for these maps. No one knew she had them. Between flights, while the others played cards or checked sports scores, she listened to archived beacon signals at different frequencies. Some were distorted by storms. Others had interference patterns she recognized from her time flying A-10s near Nangarhar. She made a separate chart, logging the signal degradation under different humidity levels. Then she taped a copy to the inside of her locker door. Once, she asked the comms tech if they had any legacy directional antennas stored in the depot. He laughed and told her the Army phased those out years ago. She found one in a broken gear bin and rebuilt it using spare wiring. It worked better than most of the base's current setups during heavy rain. She didn't mention it again. Her acoustic navigation techniques weren't something she talked about. In Afghanistan, she'd learned to fly when systems failed, when smoke blocked visuals, when GPS blacked out under jamming. She memorized how the pitch of her engines shifted in dense air, how rotor slap echoed differently depending on nearby cliffs. She could judge a canyon's curve from the way sound bounced in her helmet. None of this made it into manuals. On her own time, she practiced throttle feathering in the simulator to mimic manual descent through crosswinds. She created a routine to test audio-based heading correction, timing every second of a drift. Evelyn didn't rely on software. She relied on patterns, repetition, reaction speed that felt less like training and more like instinct now. She also kept a small waterproof case tucked behind her seat in the UH-60. Inside were low-frequency charts, a compass calibrated to jungle magnetic drift, and a spare hand mic hardwired into a battery pack. It wasn't standard, but then again, survival rarely was. Most of the base's pilots assumed she was just overly cautious. They saw her alone with charts and thought she lacked confidence. What they didn't realize was that Evelyn never prepared for average conditions. She prepared for worst case, for that one mission where nothing worked, and no one else knew what to do. It was never about being better. It was about being ready when it mattered, and she knew, eventually, it would matter. At 13:47, the distress signal punched through the static like a knife. The room froze, radios crackled, one line repeated, over and over. Mayday. Black Hawk 274 down, coordinates lost, 7 Marines, multiple wounded, possible enemy contact. Then silence again. Screens lit up with topographical layers and weather data, but it was already bad. A storm cell had merged over the eastern jungle corridor, the same canyon stretch Evelyn had been studying for weeks, the worst possible place to go down. Dense canopy, no radar clarity, no stable landing zones. Captain Rhodes scanned the data feed and shook his head. Fuel requirements exceed range limits by 40%. Visibility will be near zero in 20 minutes. Flight planning calculated the same outcome on 3 different projections. There were no safe routes in, no way to hover long enough to find survivors, let alone extract them. Colonel Gerard stepped into the room, his boots dripping mud onto the tile. His eyes moved quickly across the displays. Then he asked the question everyone was avoiding. Can we get anyone there in time? Chief Warrant Officer Reeves answered without flinching. Not without risking another aircraft and crew. It's a suicide mission, sir. We don't have time for blind recon. If we miss the coordinates, we'll lose everyone. Gerard nodded. His jaw clenched once. Then he turned toward the pilot roster, eyeing the top 3 names. The room went quiet. No one stepped forward. Lieutenant Harris, who had flown recon 2 nights earlier, didn't move. Captain West looked away, feigning focus on a flight map he'd already reviewed. The silence felt like a decision. Not one anyone wanted to say out loud, but one already made. That's when Evelyn stepped out from behind the comm station. She had been watching from the back, no one noticing her presence as usual. Her voice was steady. I'll go. Heads turned. Half the room didn't recognize her. The other half blinked like they hadn't registered what she'd said. Colonel Gerard looked at her for a full beat. Moore, your transport. This isn't a milk run. She met his eyes. I have experience in combat extraction. A-10 pilot, Afghanistan. Logged sorties under blackout conditions. I know how to get in and out when systems fail. The air shifted. She wasn't boasting. She was stating facts. But the tension stayed thick. Captain Rhodes folded his arms. That storm will kill you before you get 30 clicks in. Then I'll go 30 clicks in and reassess. But if someone doesn't try, those Marines are already gone. The room didn't argue. It paused, like no one could decide if she was brave or reckless. Then Gerard spoke, his voice low. Brief me on your route. And just like that, she was no longer invisible. She was the one standing in the middle of the map, while the others watched from the edge. Evelyn stepped forward and laid out a folded map across the operations table. It wasn't printed. It was hand-drawn, edges worn from use. Colored markings highlighted 2 narrow valleys and a dry riverbed winding through the jungle. The terrain wasn't on the current charts, but her annotations showed altitudes, tree density, even known wind shears pulled from archived meteorology data. She pointed to a marked corridor between 2 cliffs. I can fly low through here. Natural wind breaks, no radar exposure, less rotor stress. Chief Warrant Officer Reeves leaned closer. These aren't on our maps. Evelyn didn't flinch. That's because your maps rely on drone imagery. This comes from acoustic patterns and indigenous trail markers used before we ever set foot in this region. Captain Rhodes frowned. Even if you can get through there, your instruments won't hold. GPS is already degraded. That's why I won't be relying on it." She looked around the table. "I fly by echo, pressure gradients, and rotor feedback. I was trained to do this when the electronics go dark." They didn't respond immediately. It sounded like madness. But one of the comms tech specialist, Lang, spoke up from the back. "Sir, she's been testing low-band signal propagation for months. She asked me last week about beacon distortion in jungle canopy." Colonel Gerard stared at Evelyn's map, eyes narrowing as if he could will it to match what he knew. Finally, he spoke. "If you miss by even a few clicks, we won't get another shot." Evelyn nodded. "Then I won't miss?" The colonel exhaled slowly, then tapped a pen against the table once. "Prep Black Hawk 847. She flies in 15. At 15:23, Black Hawk 847 lifted off from Fob Talon under a sky already collapsing. The rain hit the windscreen in sheets, hammering hard enough to blur everything outside 10 feet. Evelyn held the collective steady as the aircraft surged upward into a roiling wall of gray. Within seconds, she lost all visual horizon. The clouds swallowed her. Turbulence slapped the fuselage like open hands. Updrafts bucked the frame. The artificial horizon spun briefly, then stabilized. She throttled down and dipped under the first layer of cloud cover, keeping the nose just level enough to avoid stalling. Crosswinds tried to peel her off the heading. The storm didn't want her in the air. By 15:29, GPS was gone. Just static on the screen. Evelyn flipped the unit off, then reached for the alternate compass mounted on the dash. It jittered, then settled as she passed through a microburst. Radio chatter was already breaking up. The last word she caught from base was visuals, then nothing. She dropped to 120 feet above canopy. The trees whipped beneath her. Leaves tore off in spirals. Rotor wash scattered debris that bounced off the skids. She adjusted pitch by feel, fingers barely resting on the cyclic. Every shift in resistance told her what the air couldn't. At 15:34, she hit her first planned corridor, a narrow valley threading west. No signal, no lights, but she had studied the terrain. Her headset buzzed with echoes. The return signature bounced faster here, telling her the canyon walls were closer. She adjusted 2 degrees left, holding just above the tree line. The UH-60 didn't want to fly this slow in this air, but she forced it to obey. Every vibration in the stick spoke to her. When the tail started to drift, she countered. When the pitch trembled, she leaned into it. This was flying by instinct, not instruction. She switched to her backup altimeter when the digital feed blinked out. Just needles now. Rain blurred the cockpit glass, and she wiped it with her sleeve. 1 second later, a gust threw the aircraft sideways. She countered with right pedal, stabilized, and pressed lower into the terrain. She couldn't see the canyon walls, but she could hear them. The rotor wash bounced off rock and told her the shape of what lay ahead. It was a kind of echolocation, old school, the kind no one trained for anymore. But she knew it better than most knew their instruments. By 15:41, her hands were soaked through her gloves. The wind screamed past the open side doors. The storm was tightening, but Evelyn wasn't slowing down. Somewhere ahead, there were 7 Marines waiting, and she wasn't turning around. Not yet. At 15:44, a faint pulse buzzed in Evelyn's headset. It was low-band, intermittent, almost masked by the storm, but not enough to miss. She adjusted heading by 3 degrees west, eyes flicking to the terrain overlay she'd drawn by hand. It matched. This was the canyon. She dipped lower, skimming just above the treetops. The UH-60 rocked with every shift in wind, tail rotor compensating against cross-blasts coming off the rock walls. On official maps, this stretch was blank, just elevation markers and guesswork. But Evelyn had traced this corridor after comparing thermal shadows with runoff patterns from flood reports. Now it was the only passage left. At 15:48, artillery rumbled in the distance. Not close, not fresh, just enough to add urgency. Then she saw it, a flicker of smoke through the mist, trailing between the trees like a dying breath. She banked left and spotted the wreckage, a black hull broken against stone. Tail section, twisted. Black Hawk 274, still smoldering. She circled once, scanning for movement. 7 figures. 3 kneeling, 2 on stretchers, 1 waving a signal panel that barely caught light. The last Marine didn't move. A medic was compressing his chest in rhythmic thrusts. Evelyn's gut clenched. She started descent. The canyon floor was a mess. Uneven rock, scattered debris, nowhere flat. No pad, no zone. Just wet stone and downed limbs. She couldn't land. Not fully. She hovered low, barely clearing the brush, then eased the bird toward a slanted boulder, dropping one skid gently onto the surface while keeping the other airborne. The aircraft groaned under strain. She locked the collective with pressure alone, counterbalancing with tail rudder, keeping the rotor arc level. The nose drifted with the wind, and she corrected in real time, holding her breath as the first Marine scrambled toward the ramp. At 15:52, the medic carried the unconscious Marine in his arms. Evelyn saw him shouting, couldn't hear it. CPR again, even while climbing. Chest compressions mid-stride. They loaded him last. Blood on his shirt. The medic tapped twice on the ramp. Evelyn didn't wait. She nosed forward, increased lift, and felt the rotor wash rebound off the stone walls. She tilted into the slope and let the pressure bounce her upward. Not textbook. Not clean. But enough. The UH-60 leapt into the air, scraped a branch, then cleared the rim with feet to spare. The canyon vanished behind her. Storm still ahead. 7 Marines aboard, 1 barely breathing, and Evelyn gripping the controls like her life depended on it. Because it did. So did theirs. At 15:56, Black Hawk 847 pulled above the rim and leveled off. The rotors fighting the weight of 7 Marines in medical gear stacked to the walls. Evelyn checked the fuel gauge. Redline wasn't minutes away, it was already creeping into margin territory. She didn't flinch. She recalculated the route in her head, factoring drift, wind angle, and terrain. She had 27 minutes of flight. 23 if she pushed through the next storm cell. She banked hard left, cutting a dogleg route through a natural air corridor she'd marked weeks earlier. Rain hammered the cockpit. The altimeter fluctuated as pressure shifted. She watched rotor RPM tick down, then corrected by dropping collective just enough to reduce torque without losing altitude. The Black Hawk bucked, but held. She kept hands light, adjusting with fingertip inputs like threading a needle through a hurricane. At 16:02, the storm thickened. Visibility dropped under 40 meters. Evelyn switched back to sound. The pitch of the blades told her how the air density was shifting. She leaned right to counter a downdraft and dove under cloud cover. Tree lines blurred by beneath her. She could feel the engines straining, the whine sharper, the rotors beginning to sag under the weight. She adjusted trim tabs manually, nudged power to 90%, held it there. That would give her 10 minutes of thrust without flameout risk. Beyond that, the bird would fly on muscle memory and hope. She pushed west, watching elevation through her backup altimeter. The one she trusted more than software. Her eyes never left it. By 16:11, the radio hissed. A broken voice from base came through. No ID, just a confirmation. You inbound Evelyn keyed the mic. 4 minutes. Get trauma ready. She didn't wait for a reply. Instead, she dropped to 90 feet to cut under a wind shear that had shredded 2 UAVs last month. The left skid clipped a branch. She banked and rolled, then stabilized as the lights of Fob Talon emerged through the mist like a shoreline from fog. She didn't slow. Couldn't. Instead, she came in hot. The bird yawing slightly under crosswind. The medics were already running, stretchers at the ready. Evelyn flared the aircraft, aimed rear first, and dropped hard. The impact rattled her teeth. But the tail ramp lined up within 2 feet of the trauma bay line. By 16:16, the Marines were being offloaded. 1 unconscious, still breathing. Evelyn sat in the seat, hands on the controls, listening to the engines spool down. For a second, she didn't move. She just breathed. The mission was done. Every second had counted. Every one. And she hadn't wasted a single one. There was no ceremony the next morning. No medals, no speech. Just a slip of paper pinned to the mission board in the operations wing. Flight 847, extraction complete. 7 Marines recovered. Pilot CW2 Evelyn Moore. It didn't draw a crowd. But those who read it paused longer than usual. Some stood in front of the board and reread it. A few exchanged glances but didn't say a word. The ones who had been in the command center the night before didn't need to speak. They remembered who had volunteered when no one else moved. Colonel Gerard didn't mention the mission in his staff brief. He didn't have to. 2 days later, he stepped into the advanced tactical flight course with a stack of hand-drawn maps and said, "These go in the curriculum." He placed them on the instructor's desk. The instructors flipped through them slowly. Wind corridors, emergency drift routes, acoustic mapping overlays. None of it was in the manual, but all of it worked. That same week, Evelyn submitted a request form. She asked to lead a voluntary elective on legacy navigation skills, low-tech, high-risk, edge-of-map scenarios. She called it contingency flight planning. No formal credit, weekend hours only. She expected to get 2 or 3 pilots, maybe a junior tech curious enough to sit in the back. Instead, she had a full roster by Thursday. Some names surprised her. Lieutenant Harris signed up. So did Captain West. Even the radar officer who once mocked her for reading wind patterns joined without comment. No one said it out loud, but they knew who had brought them home. Around base, things shifted. Slowly, quietly. Crew chiefs started asking her for feedback before cold weather checks. Pilots began cross-referencing her handwritten annotations during route prep. She noticed a copy of her beacon log posted near the backup comms panel. Someone had laminated it. Evelyn didn't change how she walked or spoke. She still kept to herself, still ran maintenance checks long after everyone else had cleared the hangar. But when she walked into the mess, heads nodded. When she passed the flight line, crew members lifted fingers off toolboxes in a quiet sign of respect. Recognition didn't come with applause. It came in the way people started to listen, in the questions they asked, in the silence they held when she spoke. That was enough. That was everything. Evelyn returned to the same routines. Only now. The base moved differently around her, not louder, just more aware. It started with a pin. One of the young Marines who had been pulled out of the wreckage crafted it from a broken piece of rotor housing. He shaped it into a small Black Hawk silhouette, barely larger than a coin, and pinned it above his name tape. He called it a Moore's wing. Within a week, 3 more appeared. Then 5. No one announced it. No memo went out. But across the base, those little metal symbols began showing up on backpacks, clipboard straps, and the corners of flight jackets. They weren't awards. They were reminders. Evelyn never commented on them. She noticed, of course. She saw the nods exchanged between crews when someone walked by wearing one. Saw the way people's eyes landed on them for just a second longer than usual. They weren't flashy. That was the point. In her elective course, the sign-up list kept growing. She added a second session to handle the overflow. Some of the names still surprised her. Staff Sergeant Vega, who once called her checklist obsessive, now took notes on everything she wrote. Flight officers started bringing their own maps, asking for feedback on how to read terrain like she did. It didn't feel like hero worship. It felt like curiosity with purpose. People wanted to understand how she'd done it, how she had made the call, flown the line, and brought everyone home when no system could help her. And when they listened, they didn't interrupt. Colonel Gerard said nothing publicly, but Evelyn noticed a few things. Her emergency beacon guide was now part of the pre-flight packet. Her acoustic navigation notes had been converted into a laminated handout for cold weather flight prep. Her altitude response grid was pinned to the wall in the ready room. The base started running drills that matched scenarios she had outlined. Zero visibility insertion with audio-only orientation, terrain following under degraded navigation, fuel calculations for overburdened lift-out. What used to be dismissed as transport pilot prep had become doctrine. The change didn't come from pressure. It came from results. From one quiet success that no one could explain away. She hadn't asked for anything. She'd just flown, adapted, and returned with 7 lives in her cabin. By the end of the month, the base motto was updated on the wall outside the operations center. The paint was still drying when Evelyn walked by and saw it. Excellence flies without permission. Courage leads without recognition. Preparation saves what bravery alone cannot. She stood there for a minute. No one else around, just her and the words. Then she nodded once and walked on. She still had a class to teach, and another map to update, just in case someone else needed it. There was never a headline, no interview, no glossy photo of Evelyn Moore with medals on her chest. But ask anyone stationed at FOB Talon, and they'll tell you about the night she flew through a storm with no instruments, brought home 7 lives, and landed with less fuel than hope. They'll tell you she didn't speak much, didn't brag, didn't ask for anything. But when she walked into a room after that mission, people noticed. They moved over. They listened. She hadn't changed. They had. It's easy to miss someone like Evelyn. She didn't demand the center seat at the table. She didn't correct others when they assumed less of her. She didn't push back loudly when she was passed over. She just did the work. Quietly. Relentlessly. And when everything went wrong, she did what others couldn't. She was ready. So, the question is, how many Evelyns do you work with? How many people show up early, stay late, and prepare when no one's looking? How many know exactly what to do when systems fail, but get overlooked because they don't fit someone's definition of leadership? We talk a lot about potential. We reward confidence, charisma, presence. But what about presence of mind? What about the person who doesn't shout over others but writes down the backup plan when everyone else walks away? You don't need a battlefield to see this. It happens in offices, in hospitals, on factory floors, in classrooms, in families. The people who make things work when everything stops working. The ones who never ask for credit, but somehow carry the weight anyway. Evelyn's story reminds us that real strength often moves quietly, that courage isn't always loud, and that the systems we rely on are only as strong as the people we sometimes overlook. So, the next time someone offers an idea in a meeting and no one hears it, listen again. The next time someone solves a problem before it becomes a crisis, ask how they saw it coming. The next time someone prepares for a storm no one else believes in, don't laugh. Watch what they do when it hits. Because maybe what we need most isn't the loudest voice in the room. Maybe it's the steady one. The one that flies into chaos without asking for permission. The one that plans for impossible conditions because they understand that someone, someday, will need them to be ready. The truth is, we live in a world that mistakes volume for value. We celebrate boldness and visibility, and sometimes forget that precision, discipline, and quiet resolve save lives too. So, here's the invitation. Look for your Evelyns. Support them. Trust them. And when the storm comes, follow them. You'll find that some of the most extraordinary missions succeed not because of who got the credit, but because someone, somewhere, was quietly preparing for the worst day, just in case it ever came. That's what Evelyn did. That's what so many like her do every day. And they're not waiting to be seen. They're just waiting for someone to believe.